The fouled anchor was less a tavern and more a pickled remnant of naval history. A place where the ghosts of sailors past seemed to soak into the dark, sticky wood of the bar. It stood just outside the main gate of Norfolk Naval Station, a squat brick building that had weathered hurricanes and bar fights with equal stoicism. The air inside was a thick concoction of stale beer, fried fish, diesel fumes from the nearby piers, and the ever-present briny scent of the Elizabeth River. It was a place of earned rest and unearned bravado, where sea stories grew taller with every glass emptied. On this particular Tuesday night, the low, rumbling hum of conversation was the establishment's heartbeat, a familiar rhythm to the men and women in various states of uniform and civilian attire who sought refuge within its walls. In a corner booth tucked away from the main flow of traffic between the bar and the dartboards, sat a woman who was the physical embodiment of anonymity. She appeared to be in her late 30s, though it was hard to tell. Her features were pleasant but unremarkable, framed by dark hair pulled back in a simple, severe knot at the nape of her neck. She wore gray slacks and a plain dark blue blouse under a nondescript raincoat, clothes that seemed chosen specifically to deflect attention. Before her on the scarred wooden table sat a single glass of water, its condensation tracing a lazy ring on the varnish. She was not reading, nor was she looking at her phone. She was simply watching, her gaze calm and steady, taking in the room with an unnerving stillness. She was a ship at anchor in a sea of boisterous waves, present but entirely separate, a detail so out of place that it became, paradoxically, invisible. Holding court near the center of the room was Lieutenant Commander Marcus Wallace. Wallace was a man carved from the very archetype of naval ambition. He was tall, with a chest that strained against the fabric of his khaki service uniform, and a jaw that looked as if it had been specifically designed for clenching in moments of righteous authority. He had the kind of deep, resonant voice that carried effortlessly over the din, and he used it to great effect, recounting a recent training exercise with the theatrical flair of a seasoned performer. A small constellation of junior officers and enlisted men orbited him, their laughter coming a half-second too quickly after his punchlines. Wallace was the master of his small universe, a domain defined by rank, tradition, and the unspoken rules of a warrior culture. He saw the world through a rigid hierarchy, a ladder upon which he was steadily, and in his mind, deservedly, climbing. His gaze, sweeping the room for his next audience member, eventually snagged on the woman in the corner. He paused mid-sentence, a frown creasing his brow. In the ecosystem of the fouled anchor, she was an anomaly, an invasive species. The bar was an unofficial extension of the base, a place for those who served. Civilians were tolerated if they were family or contractors with a clear purpose. But this woman, she fit no recognizable category. She was alone. She was quiet. She was, in his estimation, trespassing on sacred ground. His internal calculus, honed by years of making snap judgments based on appearance and bearing, rendered its verdict with swift and absolute certainty. She did not belong. He excused himself from his circle of admirers, the casual motion of his departure carrying the weight of impending action. He moved through the crowd not like a man navigating a room, but like a destroyer cutting through a calm sea, expecting the lesser vessels to give way. And they did. He stopped before her booth, planting his hands on his hips in a posture of casual interrogation. The woman did not look up immediately. She finished a slow, deliberate sip of her water, placed the glass back down precisely in its wet ring, and only then did she lift her eyes to meet his. They were a cool, dispassionate gray, like the sea on a winter morning. "Can I help you, ma'am?" Wallace's voice was coated in a thin veneer of politeness, but the condescension underneath was as thick as engine grease. It was the tone one used for a lost tourist who had wandered into the wrong part of town. The woman's expression did not change, not a flicker of surprise or fear or deference. "I don't believe so," she said. Her voice was as controlled and even as her gaze, without inflection. The response, or rather the lack of a proper one, irked him. He expected a flustered explanation, an apology, some recognition of his inherent authority in this space. He was, after all, a lieutenant commander. She was nothing. "This is a military bar," he stated, letting the words hang in the air as if they were self-evident truths. "It's for service members. people who understand the culture. I'm aware, she replied, her voice remaining perfectly level. She made no move to leave, no gesture of apology. She simply sat there, a bastion of calm against his rising tide of irritation. Her stillness was a form of defiance more infuriating than any shouted insult. It was as if a lioness were allowing a jackal to dance at the edge of its kill radius, acknowledging its presence without deeming it a threat. Wallace leaned forward, placing his palms flat on her table. The move was meant to be intimidating, a physical assertion of dominance. He was now invading her personal space, his shadow falling across her. Look, I don't know who you're waiting for, but this isn't the place. There's a TGI Fridays down the road that's probably more your speed. His words dripped with dismissive prejudice, the assumption clear. She was a camp follower, a civilian woman looking to latch onto a man in uniform. It was an old, ugly stereotype, and he wielded it like a club. The woman finally blinked, a slow, deliberate motion. She looked down at his hands on her table, then back up at his face. A lesser person would have shrunk back. A more aggressive person would have told him to back off. She did neither. Instead, a very slight, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of her lips, a fleeting expression of something that looked dangerously like pity. I am quite comfortable here, Lieutenant Commander, she said, her use of his rank a subtle, precise jab. It acknowledged his status while simultaneously dismissing its relevance to their interaction. The quiet precision of her response was a spark on a short fuse. His face, which looked like it had been carved from naval tradition itself, darkened. The jovial commander holding court was gone, replaced by the rigid enforcer of an unwritten code. You think you're clever, don't you? You civilians come in here thinking you can get a piece of the glory without any of the sacrifice. You don't know the first thing about what we do, about the price we pay. His voice had risen, drawing the attention of the surrounding tables. The low hum of the bar began to falter as heads turned. The chorus of onlookers, Wallace's junior officers and a few curious sailors, watched the drama unfold. They saw a senior officer, a man they respected or feared, confronting a lone, plain-looking woman. Their institutional instinct sided with Inhuman. She was the outsider. He was one of them. They saw a simple correction of a social breach, not the bullying of an insecure man. They were complicit in their silence, their neutrality a tacit endorsement of his actions. The woman, for her part, seemed utterly oblivious to the growing audience. Her focus remained solely on him. The price is indeed high, she said, her voice now tinged with a clinical coldness. Perhaps higher than you are capable of calculating. That was it. For Wallace, this was the final straw. It was an intellectual challenge from someone he had already deemed intellectually inferior. His frustration, born from her refusal to be intimidated, boiled over into a petty, physical act. He made a show of scoffing, and as he pushed himself back from the table, he accidentally swept his hand across it, knocking her glass of water over. The glass tumbled, spilling its contents across the wood and into her lap. He offered a mock apology. Oh, clumsy me. Looks like you've had a spill. Maybe you should go get cleaned up. Elsewhere. The room was silent now. The confrontation had crossed a line from verbal to physical. The woman looked down at the dark patch spreading across her gray slacks, then back at Wallace. She did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She did not stand. She simply sat there, drenched and composed, her gray eyes locking onto his. In that moment, the power dynamic, which had seemed so clear, began to warp and invert. His aggression looked childish, his dominance pathetic. Her silence was no longer passive. It was an indictment. It was the unnerving calm of a bomb disposal expert looking at a device they had built themselves. It was at that precise moment of excruciating silence that the world changed. It began not as a sound, but as a feeling, a deep, resonant vibration that traveled up from the soles of their feet, through the concrete foundation of the building, and into the marrow of their bones. It was a low-frequency groan, the sound of a god clearing his throat. Glasses on the bar rattled. The wooden beams of the old tavern creaked in protest. Every head in the room, including Wallace's, snapped toward the large windows that faced the piers. Then came the sound, a horrific shriek of tortured metal, a colossal tearing noise that ripped through the night air. It was followed by a concussive boom that shook the building with violent force, shattering one of the windows and sending a spiderweb of cracks through the others. Alarms began to scream from the naval station, a cacophony of urgent, piercing wails that signaled a catastrophe of the highest order. The patrons of the fouled anchor, sailors and officers all, reacted with ingrained instinct. They were on their feet, chairs scraping and crashing to the floor, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning dread. They surged toward the dorsers. Through the remaining intact windows, the scene was one of chaos and impossibility. The USS Vigilance, the newest and most advanced destroyer in the Atlantic Fleet, a 10,000-ton behemoth of gray steel and classified technology, was in distress. The ship, which should have been securely moored to Pier 7, was listing heavily to starboard. Its sleek, angular superstructure canted at a terrifying angle. Massive mooring lines as thick as a man's thigh had snapped, their frayed ends whipping through the air like dying serpents. The pier itself was groaning, chunks of concrete breaking away and splashing into the dark water. The ship was threatening to capsize, to roll over and crush the pier, its fuel and its ordnance, into a cataclysmic disaster. Panic began to set in. This was not a drill. This was an unprecedented, unfolding crisis. Lieutenant Commander Wallace, his petty confrontation with the woman in the booth instantly forgotten, snapped into what he thought was command mode. "Everyone stay calm," he bellowed, his voice straining to be heard over the alarms. "Petty officer, get a head count. Lieutenants, with me. We need to establish a perimeter and assist base security." His orders were loud, authoritative, and entirely by the book. They were also utterly useless. A head count in a tavern was irrelevant. Establishing a perimeter was a job for the master-at-arms, who were no doubt already scrambling. His response was the conditioned reflex of a mid-level manager facing an office fire, not the calculated action of a leader confronting a genuine disaster. He was adding to the noise, not cutting through it. He was a product of a system designed for predictable emergencies, and this was anything but. While Wallace was shouting, the woman in the booth finally moved, but her movement was not one of panic. It was a fluid, economical unfolding of her body from the booth, a single graceful motion that was shockingly purposeful. She rose to her feet, water dripping from her slacks onto the floor, her face a mask of intense, absolute focus. The anonymous plain woman was gone. In her place was someone else entirely, a person whose entire being had shifted from a state of passive observation to one of hyper-focused action. Her gray eyes, which had been so calm, now scanned the scene outside the window with a terrifyingly rapid, analytical precision. They weren't just seeing a listing ship, they were reading it, diagnosing it, calculating the stresses on its hull and the physics of its imminent failure. She began to walk toward the door, her path taking her directly past the blustering Lieutenant Commander Wallace. She did not shove him aside. She simply moved with such undeniable purpose that he found himself instinctively stepping out of her way, a subconscious act of deference to a superior force he could not yet comprehend. As she passed him, she spoke, and her voice was utterly transformed. The quiet, even tone was gone, replaced by a voice that was not loud, but carried an intrinsic authority that cut through the surrounding chaos like a laser. It was the voice of pure, undiluted command. "That's a cascade mooring failure. The primary and secondary bollards on the forward pier section have sheared off. She's pivoting on her stern lines." Her words were a torrent of technical observation, spoken to no one in particular, yet intended for everyone. "The starboard list is increasing at 2 degrees per minute. She's taking on water below the waterline, likely a hull breach from impact with a submerged pier piling. Ballast control is compromised." Wallace stared at her, his mouth agape. It was as if the woman had suddenly started speaking a foreign language, a language he was supposed to know but didn't, not at this level of fluency. It was the language of naval architecture, of catastrophic damage control, of high-level engineering. How could this woman, this civilian, possibly know these things? She didn't wait for an answer. She was already at the door, pushing her way out into the maelstrom of flashing lights, screaming alarms, and panicked shouts. Outside, the scene was even worse. Rain had begun to fall, a cold, miserable drizzle that slicked the pavement. Fire trucks and emergency vehicles were screaming onto the scene. their lights painting the listing destroyer in strobing reds and blues. Dock workers and naval personnel were running some away from the danger, some toward it, their movements frantic and uncoordinated. The great ship groaned again, a sound of immense agony, and listed another few degrees, the angle now visibly critical. The woman stood on the pavement for a second, her head cocked as if listening to the ship's death rattle. Then she began to issue orders, not to the officers around her, but into a small, plain-looking cell phone she had pulled from her pocket. She didn't dial. She simply spoke to it. "This is Eris. I am invoking Protocol Zero. I need a direct, open channel to the Damage Control Central of the USS Vigilance now. Override local command authority. Authentication code, Sierra Tango November 700. A young ensign, fresh from the academy, overheard her. He ran up, his face pale with a mixture of fear and duty. "Ma'am, you can't be here. This is a restricted area. Who are you?" She didn't even look at him. Her eyes remained locked on the dying ship. "Get me the senior engineer on the pier, the one in charge of shore power. Find him, bring him to me, tell him it's a load-shedding emergency and I need to reroute all available amperage to the ship's aft pump systems. Tell him this authorization is Iris 0. Go, now." The ensign was frozen. The sheer unadulterated authority in her voice was paralyzing. It was an authority that did not derive from the rank on her collar, because she had none. It radiated from her like heat from a furnace, a pure, elemental force of competence. Lieutenant Commander Wallace, who had followed her out of the bar, stood a few feet away, utterly bewildered. He watched as the ensign, a commissioned officer in the United States Navy, simply stammered, "Yes, ma'am," and turned to sprint off into the chaos, obeying the command of an unknown civilian without a moment's hesitation. The phone in her hand crackled to life. "Channel is open. DC Central. You have a priority 0 call." "This is Eris," the woman said, her voice dropping into a clipped, precise cadence. "Report your status. What is the condition of watertight doors on decks 3 and 4? Are you counter-flooding? Report your trim and stability calculations. Now." A panicked voice came back through the phone's speaker, tinny and strained. "Ma'am, who is this? We have a major hull breach in compartments 4 Bravo and 4 Charlie. The pumps can't keep up. The chief engineer is saying we need to abandon ship." "Negative, chief," the woman snapped back, her voice like a whip crack. "You will not abandon ship. You are counter-flooding incorrectly. You're fighting the list. You need to work with it. I want you to immediately seal all compartments on the starboard side, decks 1 through 3. Then I want you to begin flooding portside voids 3 Alpha, 3 Delta, and 5 Golf. Do it sequentially, not simultaneously. You need to shift the center of gravity down and inboard, not just add weight. It will increase the list temporarily before it stabilizes. Do you copy?" There was a moment of stunned silence from the ship. Then a different voice, older and calmer, came on the line. The voice of the chief engineer. "Ma'am, these are non-standard procedures. They aren't in the DC manual." "The DC manual was written for a ship that hasn't been built yet," the woman retorted, her voice devoid of patience. "I wrote the addendum for this exact scenario. It's classified level 5. Now, are you going to follow my instructions, or are you going to watch my ship roll over and sink at her own pier?" My ship, the words echoed in the rainy air, hanging there for Wallace to hear. My ship. The possessive pronoun was so audacious, so unbelievable, that his brain simply refused to process it. He could only watch, a statue of obsolete authority, as this woman conducted a symphony of salvation from the wet pavement. She was a whirlwind of focused energy, one hand holding the phone to her ear, the other gesturing, pointing, directing the flow of personnel and equipment that was beginning to converge on her as if she were a magnetic pole. She directed fire crews to cool the strained metal of the pier supports. She ordered the shore power engineer who had been found and brought to her to perform a complex series of breakers flips that would have fried the entire station's grid if done incorrectly. She was not just managing the crisis, she was mastering it, her mind operating on a level of complexity that left everyone else in the dust. The crowd of onlookers, Wallace included, was rendered silent, frozen in a state of awe and dawning comprehension. They were witnessing a masterclass, a virtuoso performance of a skill so profound it bordered on magic. They were watching a single, unassuming woman bend a 10,000-ton catastrophe to her will through sheer intellect and force of personality. The ship, under her remote guidance, groaned again, and the terrifying list to starboard actually increased for a moment, just as she had predicted. A collective gasp went through the crowd. But then, slowly, miraculously, the motion stopped. The ship settled, hanging at a precarious but stable angle. The immediate danger of capsizing had been averted. It was into this tableau of stunned silence and temporary victory that a new element arrived. A black sedan with government plates and flashing lights screeched to a halt nearby. The rear door flew open and out stepped a man who needed no introduction on any naval base in the world. He was Fleet Admiral Marcus Thorne, the commander of the U.S. Atlantic Fleet. He was a living legend, a man whose face was a roadmap of command decisions made under fire. His presence alone signaled the gravity of the situation. He began barking orders to his aide, his eyes sweeping the scene, taking in the controlled chaos. Then his eyes landed on the woman with the phone. He stopped dead in his tracks. His stern, authoritative expression dissolved, replaced by something else entirely. A look of immediate, profound, and absolute respect. He ignored the listing destroyer. He ignored the assembled officers. He ignored Lieutenant Commander Wallace standing nearby. His entire world narrowed to that one woman. He strode toward her, his movements crisp and urgent. He did not call out to her. He simply approached. And as he drew near, he did something that sent a shockwave through every single service member present. Fleet Admiral Marcus Thorne, a four-star admiral at the apex of his career, snapped to the sharpest, most rigid position of attention he had likely ever held. He raised his hand in a salute so precise it could have been used for a training manual. "Ma'am on deck," he barked, his voice a thunderclap that silenced the last vestiges of chaos. The effect was instantaneous and electric. Every officer, every sailor, every petty officer who heard the command and saw the gesture reacted with the force of 1,000 years of naval tradition. They spun, they straightened, they saluted. They created a sea of white hats and khaki covers, all directed at the unassuming woman in the drenched gray slacks. Lieutenant Commander Wallace, his mind reeling, found his body reacting before his brain could catch up. His arms snapped up in a salute, his muscles obeying a command that his consciousness could not fathom. He was saluting the woman he had tried to humiliate not 10 minutes earlier. The woman Iris finally lowered her phone. She turned to face the admiral. She did not return the salute. As a civilian, she was not required to. Instead, she gave a slight, tired nod of her head. "Admiral, glad you could make it. We've stabilized her for now, but the hull is compromised. We need to get her into dry dock as soon as the storm breaks." The admiral held his salute. "Whatever you need, Doctor. The resources of the entire Atlantic Fleet are at your disposal." He finally lowered his hand, but remained at a respectful position of attention. "Report? Cascading failure of the new composite bollards," she said clinically. "The sheer stress tolerance was miscalculated in the final design integration. My fault. I should have caught it. The impact with the pier support caused a fracture along a submerged weld seam. We're holding, but it's tenuous." It was then that the admiral's gaze finally fell upon Lieutenant Commander Wallace, still standing nearby, his arm frozen in a half-hearted salute, his face a perfect mask of utter, soul-shattering confusion. The admiral's eyes narrowed. "Lieutenant Commander, what is your role in this?" Before Wallace could stammer out an answer, the woman spoke. "The lieutenant commander was assisting me with a matter of internal discipline, Admiral." Her voice was neutral, betraying nothing. But the admiral had seen the spilled water on her clothes, had seen the proximity of Wallace to her before the crisis. He was a man who had built a career on reading men, and he read Wallace's guilt and arrogance like an open book. But he deferred to her. He turned back to the woman, and the narrator of this modern fable, the institution of the Navy itself, finally let the bomb drop. He spoke her name, and with it, her legend descended upon the pier like a ton of steel. "Dr. Eris Thorne," the admiral said, his voice filled with a reverence that bordered on awe. "Chief design architect for the entire Vigilance-class program. The woman who designed the reactors that power these ships, the hull that keeps them afloat, and the damage control systems that are, as of this moment, saving this one from sinking. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice rising to address the assembled, saluting crowd, "you are in the presence of the finest naval engineer of the 21st century. Her authority on this vessel, and any vessel of her design, supersedes my own. It supersedes the authority of the Secretary of the Navy. It is absolute." The name fell upon Wallace like a physical blow. Dr. Eris Thorne, not just an engineer, but the engineer, the mind behind the machine. He remembered seeing the name on briefings, on technical specifications, a distant, almost mythical figure spoken of in hushed tones at the Pentagon. They called her Sea Dragon, the civilian genius who operated outside the normal chain of command, a living treasure of naval science. And he had told her to go to TGY on Fridays. He had knocked a glass of water into her lap. The sheer, monumental scale of his arrogance, his catastrophic failure of judgment, threatened to swallow him whole. His worldview, built on the solid bedrock of rank and appearance, had just been pulverized into dust. After the immediate crisis was fully contained, hours later when the ship was secured by emergency cables and the rain had finally subsided, Dr. Thorne found Wallace. He was standing alone near the end of a different pier, staring at his reflection in the dark, oily water. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost, the ghost of his own career. She came to stand beside him. She was wearing a dry navy parka someone had given her. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the distant clang of metal on metal and the gentle lapping of the water against the pilings. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet again, the authoritative edge gone, replaced by a surgeon's precision. "You made a mistake tonight, Lieutenant Commander." "Ma'am," he choked out, the word tasting like ash. There are no words. I am prepared to accept full responsibility. I will tender my resignation in the morning." She turned her head to look at him, her gray eyes unreadable in the dim light. "You think this is about your career? About your pride?" she asked. "You think the error you made was one of social etiquette? That is not your failure. Your failure was tactical. It was a failure of intelligence, of observation, of threat assessment." She took a step closer. "You looked at me and saw what you expected to see. A woman, a civilian, someone outside your hierarchy. You made an assumption based on a flawed, prejudiced data set. You failed to gather information. You failed to observe your environment. You saw a person who did not fit your narrow definition of importance, and you dismissed them. In a combat situation, a failure of that magnitude would not result in an embarrassing story. It would result in a neatly folded flag being handed to your next of kin. Every word was a perfectly aimed shot, dismantling his ego piece by piece. This was not a dressing down. It was a clinical, brutal after-action report on his own character. "Your punishment will not be a letter of reprimand or a forced resignation," she continued, her voice hardening slightly. "That would be an easy way out. You would become a cautionary tale, but you would not learn the lesson. Your education, it seems, has been neglected." He looked at her, confused. "Ma'am, I am officially requisitioning you to my staff," she stated, as if discussing a supply order. "Effective 0600 tomorrow, you will be my personal military liaison for the vigilance refit and investigation. You will carry my bags. You will schedule my meetings. You will stand outside conference rooms and ensure no one disturbs me. For the next 18 months, your entire world will be my world. You will witness firsthand what competence looks like when it is not wearing a uniform. You will learn to see the person, not the rank. You will learn humility. That is your punishment. And your education?" Dismissed. She turned and walked away without another word, leaving him alone on the pier, a man completely and utterly broken, but on the first step of a long road to being rebuilt. The story of that night, of course, passed into legend. They called it the Night of the List, or Wallace's Folly. It became a fable told to plebes at Annapolis and to newly commissioned ensigns in the fleet, a stark reminder that the most important person in the room is not always the one with the loudest voice or the most stripes on their sleeve. The details grew with each telling. The storm became a hurricane. The list became near vertical. The admiral was said to have kneeled. But the core truth of it, the essential lesson, remained pure. 5 years later, in a lecture hall at the Naval War College, a guest speaker stood before a class of the Navy's brightest young commanders. The speaker was Commander Marcus Wallace. He was leaner, his face etched with a quiet wisdom that had replaced the arrogant swagger of his youth. He was now one of the most respected instructors in the service, known for his brutally honest lessons on leadership and character. He stood before the class and he told them a story. He told them about a Tuesday night in a dockside bar. He told them about a quiet woman in a gray coat. He told them about his own breathtaking arrogance, sparing no humiliating detail. He recounted her words, her actions, her unnerving calm, and he told them about the 18 months he spent as her shadow, watching her redesign a ship's mooring systems, rewrite safety protocols, and brief four-star admirals and congressional committees with the same cool, unassailable competence. He described how he learned more about leadership, duty, and honor by carrying her briefcase than he had in all his years of command. I was the antagonist in a story that night, he concluded, his voice steady and clear. A story about a hidden master. My humiliation was the pivot upon which the moral of that story turned. Do not be me. When you walk into a room, your first task is not to announce your presence, but to observe. It is to identify the quiet professional, the one who is watching, listening, and thinking. True strength, true authority is not loud. It is not boastful. It is quiet. It is competent. It is the unassuming woman in the corner who, when the world begins to tear itself apart, is the only one who knows how to put it back together. Your job is to find that person, and when you do, get out of their way and do exactly as they say. The lesson, born of one man's humbling, became the wisdom of a generation of officers. It was a simple, profound truth, forged in a moment of crisis on a rainy pier in Norfolk. That substance will always eventually triumph over style. That competence is the only true currency of command, and that one should never, ever judge the quiet ones. For in their silence, they are often listening to the subtle mechanics of the world, and in their stillness, they are simply waiting for the moment when they are needed most. The legend of Dr. Eris Thorne served as an eternal reminder that the greatest weapons in any arsenal are not the ships or the missiles, but the brilliant, focused minds of the quiet professionals who built them. Their authority needs no uniform, for it is etched into the very fabric of their invaluable and often invisible contributions. They are the foundation upon which everything else is built, and they are to be respected, always.